In this video tutorial, I will explain how to use the automatic refresh feature in AwareIM. The automatic refresh feature forces a query, a form, or a content panel in a visual perspective to refresh its contents by asking the server to retrieve the updated data and redisplaying this data. Sometimes AwareIM does this automatically, without you having to do anything in the configuration of your application. And sometimes you need to explicitly indicate when and how to do this. We will look at both scenarios. So when does AwareIM do it automatically? When you define a panel operation that starts a process for a query or form. For example, in the library sample application, we have a business object that represents a received email. This object has a state attribute which can be read or unread. And we have a process called mark as read that changes the state of the object. This process is started from a panel operation defined in the form of the object. Let's see what happens when the user starts this operation. So we log into the application using the browser, and here in the to-do list I have an unread email. The status of the object is unread. We start the operation, the process runs, and you can see that the form automatically refreshes itself after the process finishes and the new status is displayed. This behavior makes sense. Usually, when you start a process from a form or a query, the process changes the data displayed by the form or the query. So you need to refresh the data straight away in order to show the results of the process to the user. Of course, sometimes a process does not change the data displayed by the form or the query. And if you want to suppress an unnecessary refresh, there is a way to do this by ticking this checkbox. So for processes, auto-refresh happens automatically without you having to do anything in the configuration. For other types of operations, though, automatic refresh does not happen unless you explicitly indicate that it should happen. Let's look at the create object operation, for example. Here I have a small application from previous tutorials that allows me to manage users. In this application, I have a query that shows all available users. There is a panel operation of the create object type that creates a new user. Let's see how this operation works. So we'll log into the application, run our query, and invoke the operation. We create a new user. But you can see that the new user is not automatically shown in the list of users. If we refresh the list explicitly, pressing this button here, we now see that the new user appears in the list. In this particular case, we obviously want the list to refresh automatically without having to do it explicitly. To do this, we go to the auto refresh property of the query and add the regular user object to the list of objects that trigger automatic refresh. This means that whenever a user creates or modifies any instance of a regular user object, our query will automatically refresh its data. Let's see how this works now. So we log into the application again, run our query, and create a new object. Now we can see that the query refreshes itself automatically. Quite often, a query or a form or a content panel of a visual perspective needs to automatically refresh in response to some user action that has not been started from the query or form itself. For example, in the project management sample application, we have a button that starts the new task process. When the process finishes and the task is created, the query that shows the Gantt chart needs to automatically refresh itself to show the newly created task. But the button that creates a new task is not implemented as an operation of the query. It is defined in the menu of the system. This means that we need to add the new task process to the list of processes that trigger auto refresh of the query. So we go to the Gantt chart query, go to the auto refresh property, and we can see the new task process in the list of processes that trigger auto refresh of the query. It doesn't matter where in the user interface the process is invoked. Once the process finishes, the query or the form will be refreshed. The same applies to business objects. If an object is added to the auto refresh list of the query or form, wherever the user creates or modifies any instance of this object, the query or form will be refreshed. Note also, and this is quite important, that this only applies to processes and objects activated by the user explicitly. If an object is modified not explicitly by the user, but inside the system, by a rule for example, or if a process is started inside the system, there will be no auto refresh, even if you add such process or object to the list. Let's now look at the auto refresh of a content panel in a visual perspective. Usually, there is no need to define auto refresh options for content panels, because most of them show queries or forms anyway, and you would define auto refresh options for those forms and queries, rather than for content panels that include them. Some content panels, though, show HTML content, and this HTML content may refer to some objects and attributes. And if these objects and attributes change as a result of a user action, you may need to refresh such a content panel. Let's look at the Sales Portal sample application for an example. So here I have logged into the Sales Portal application, and I go to the Team Efficiency tab, and here I have a short information about a selected employee. And when I select a different employee, this information changes to reflect the information of the newly selected employee. Let's see how this has been implemented. If we look at the Team Efficiency visual perspective, we can see that the content panel showing the bio of the employee is implemented as HTML snippet. And this snippet refers to the attributes of the currently selected employee here and here. When the user changes the currently selected employee, the employee selected process runs, and at this point we need to refresh HTML so that it shows new values. Therefore, if we look at the auto refresh options of the content panel, we can see the employee selected process in the list of the auto refresh options of the panel. Let me show you now one common application scenario that heavily relies on auto refresh. I will go back to the application created in one of the previous tutorials, where we have an ancestry tree. Here we have the person object, and each person can have one or more children, which are also represented by the person object. First, let's display a layout when we show all available people on the left, and when the user selects a person, its form is displayed on the right. We already have a query that shows all people, and this query has the edit operation as the default one. The operation shows the form of the person. We will now create a visual perspective with a column layout consisting of 2 columns with 2 content panels. We will call the first content panel People, and the second one will be Form. We will put the People query into the first content panel, and the second content panel will be initially empty. We will direct the output of the first content panel into the second one. This way, when the user selects a person, the output of the edit operation that shows the form of the person will be displayed on the right. Let's see how this works. So we'll log into this application and see the list of people on the left. When we select a person, its form is displayed on the right. No surprises here. We are not using auto refresh anywhere, as there is no need to. Let's say now that when the user selects a person, not only do we need to show the form of the selected person, but we also show the children of the selected person underneath the form. How do we do this? We can no longer rely on the output of the first panel to be in the second one. This is not enough, as we now need to display 3 panels. So here is what we do. Let's define 3 panels first. We add another content panel called Children, and this content panel will now be last in the second column instead of the second panel. We will also remove the second panel as output of the first one. Let's also make the second and third panels HTML panels. We can put some empty HTML there, or we can even initially say that nothing is selected. You can make this HTML look really nice, but for now I will just put the words "nothing selected" there and nothing else. and in the third panel we'll just display nothing. Let's now change what happens when the user selects a person. Rather than showing the form of the person, we will start a process. This process will just store the selected person and do nothing else. Where can the process store the selected person? The obvious place is somewhere in the logged-in user object. So we will add a reference to the selected person to the regular user object. And now we will write the process that just sets this user. The person object will be the input to this process. And its rule will look like this. And then we'll change our people query to call this process rather than show the form. Let's see what happens now. When we log into the application now, we can see the list of people on the left as before, and we can see our HTML panel displaying nothing selected. When we select a person, nothing happens. Our process runs, but obviously nothing changes on the screen, because the process just stores the selection and does nothing else. But here is the crucial part that involves auto refresh. Let's get both content panels that show HTML to auto refresh when the select person process finishes. Moreover, when we define auto refresh properties, there is an option to specify the process that will implement auto refresh. By default, when auto refreshing, AwareIM just asks the server to get the latest data for the query, form or content panel and displays this data. But with this option, we can get it to perform custom auto refresh. Let's write this process for the content panel that shows the form. This process will just show the form of the currently selected person stored in the logged-in user. Now we can specify this process as implementation process for auto refresh. The trigger for auto refresh will still be the select person process. But the implementation of auto refresh will be the refresh form process. We do something similar for the query that shows children of the selected person. First, let's define such a query. It is simple enough. Now let's define a process that will display this query. And finally, let's define auto-refresh options for the content panel. Let's see how this works. So now, initially our HTML is shown as before, nothing selected, but when we select a person, you can see that its form is displayed in the second content panel on the right, and the list of children is displayed underneath the form in the third content panel. And when we select another person, both the form and the query underneath the form are refreshed. So by using the refresh implementation process, we can actually change contents of the panel in response to some user action. This is a very powerful technique indeed.